So, well, welcome everybody to the final Fireside chat of the LongHashX accelerator program. We're going to talk about decentralized governance today. Just as the previous Fireside chat that we had, we do have a special guest. So we have Kei from Gnosis or Zodiac. So what we'll do today is, we'll start with some intros from Kei. Then I'll talk a little bit about the structure for the session. I think as usual, what we'll do is we'll try to spend, about maybe 20 minutes or so with Kei and I sharing a few thoughts on decentralized governance. And then after that, we'll just pass it over to you guys so that you can ask all the questions that are on your mind about decentralized governance. So anyway, without further ado, so Kei, welcome to the Fireside chat. And do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and Gnosis and Zodiac?
Sure. So I can say a little bit about myself and the project, and then I have a couple of slides just to introduce the project, and then later I can reshare again and have some slides just to introduce the tooling more concretely.
Fantastic.
So hey everyone, I'm Kei. I've been working at Gnosis for the last 4 years, since 2017. So Gnosis has built things like prediction markets, decentralized trading protocols, and the Gnosis Safe, which is a really popular multi-sig wallet on Ethereum. And I worked in communications and strategy at the company, and I'm a kind of writer, artist, and developer in my other work as well. And just a couple of months ago, we Zodiac, which is by a team that's incubated at Gnosis called Gnosis Guilds. And we're a small team that's trying to use the tools that we're building for governance. And basically, as a team, we saw the opportunity because the Safe really kind of blew up in DAO use, right? To start a Safe, you often start a Safe treasury for your DAO. And we saw that this was like a real opportunity, both in our needs, building Gnosis DAO and trying to put which frameworks we would use, as well as kind of what the ecosystem needed to kind of connect plug and play pieces for the DAO ecosystem and not have people locked into kind of monolithic platforms. So I'll just share my screen and talk a little bit about Zodiac more concretely. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So Zodiac, we're calling the expansion pack for DAOs. So basically, it's a composable design philosophy for DAOs and a collection of tools built according to an open standard. Because as we say, DAOs are not monoliths, they are constellations. And it launched with 4 tools by our team, Gnosis Guilds. So they're called Exit, Bridge, Delay, which join Reality, which some of you might formerly know as SafeSnap, and the collection of tools. And they're all available today through the Gnosis Safe and the Zodiac app, where you can use the Zodiac app to equip and stack Zodiac mods. And more than a collection of tools, it's also an open standard on which anyone can build to ensure DAO interoperability. So in addition to the tools which our team launched, there's also several others. And each tool adheres to the Zodiac open standard, which consists of avatars, modules, modifiers, and guards. And the current collection of tools soon to all be available through the Zodiac app encompass, obviously, the Gnosis Safe. And so while Zodiac tools embrace Gnosis Safe as a kind of programmable account at its core, ultimately, Zodiac tools can be built around any account standard that incorporates the iAvatar library. And also there's Safe Minion, which was developed by the DAO House team. This basically allows Moloch DAOs to manage a Gnosis Safe's digital assets based on the outcome of Moloch DAO proposals. There's also Sila, which was developed by TokenWalk, which allows accounts or avatars to operate with trustless tokenized DGov and basically switch out strategies similar to Compound or Gitcoin and choose different strategies for different teams that participate in a DAO network. There's also Scope, which is a kind of guard that allows an avatar or module to limit the scope of the functions with which it can interact. This enables DAOs to define granular permissions for different control mechanisms. And overall, these mods are designed to take decision-making beyond token voting, looking to hybrid models using time delays and anti-collusion signaling methods. At its core, the Zodiac open standard decouples avatars from decision-making. meaning that practices surrounding governance, membership, and treasury management can be customized independently of the affordances of any of the tools a DAO uses. So in short, with a programmable account like Gnosis Safe at their core, Zodiac enables DAOs to be kind of living, breathing, evolving organizations in a way that existing DAO platforms do not. And so our team, Gnosis Guild, we call a society for interdependent software with values of conviviality, co-ownership, and experimentation. And we're incubated by Gnosis at the moment. And from basically closely observing the rise of Gnosis Safe, our awareness of the DAO technology stack lacks composability ignited the initiative for Zodiac. And while we're a core contributor to Zodiac and kind of a keeper of the open standard, anyone can contribute to the Zodiac compliant collection of tools by submitting a pull request on the repo. And if you go also to our GitHub repo, you can see tutorials there and basically a super easy new tutorial that we published last week about how to build your own Zodiac mod. And as a team, we embrace practices that will over time meaningfully distribute contribution, governance, and ownership of the value Zodiac produces. So you can learn more about us on our blog. And yeah, I'll share more about the specific tools maybe after a longer discussion.
Fantastic, awesome. Thank you, Kia, for introducing yourself and Gnosis, as well as all the Zodiac tools. And I think it might sound a little overwhelming, but I think what's important to note is that all this tooling is so critical to enabling decentralized governance. And I think this is probably a good segue into the starting point of the discussion, which is really, before we get into the nitty-gritty details of, how do you decentralize, what are the models, what are the tools and processes, et cetera. I think it's important to take a step back and think, why do it, right? Why decentralize in the first place, even though, everybody seems to be doing it. And I think what's important to understand here is, I think all of us in Web3, I guess, understand and I suppose adhere to the philosophy of decentralization. And it doesn't really stop at decentralization from a technology point of view, building on a blockchain, but it actually goes beyond that. And it goes beyond that in the sense of, how a protocol, whether it's, a DeFi a protocol, an NFT platform, infrastructure, et cetera, how it's run and why being decentralized is important is because just as having just as being decentralized from a technology perspective and the benefits that brings, similarly being decentralized from a community, from a team, from the way the protocol is run perspective is also important, to prevent things like, attack, censorship, being shut down, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I guess that's more from a risk mitigation point of view. But I think if you take it one step further, decentralizing, governance and running the protocol, also brings a lot of other benefits. For example, being able to scale up the teams. I think if you look at, some of the more successful, especially DeFi protocols that have decentralized over the last 12 to 18 months, is that by shifting a lot of the decision making and a lot of the activities to the community, you actually are able to crowdsource a lot of the skills that are required, right? So not just development, but it could be things like design, economics, risk analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very powerful step to take as a Web3 protocol or project. And I think the other thing as well that is important to note, and I know that, in the cohort, we have teams that are at different stages of development, but I think a lot of times, projects would think that, okay, we start out as a core team, we build out a V1, and then later, once we've done that, once we've, launched the product, launched the token, then we can think about decentralization. Actually, the reality is that there are more and more projects that are actually being launched as DAOs from the start, right? So it's never too late, it's never too early, I should say, to think about decentralization and to think about how are you going to actually shift the running of the project from the core team to the community. So maybe with that being said, let me also share my screen, and I'll use our Web3 governance blueprint report, which I shared over Slack as a bit of a guide. To guide us through the discussion. So the first thing I wanted to introduce are what are the different elements or dimensions to decentralization, how you should think about it. So the first one is structure, which is really around, what should you decentralize, to what degree should you decentralize, and when should you decentralize what. The second one is processes and tools. And so I think this one is where Kei will talk a little bit about, the tools and specifically how it fits into the different processes of governance. And then lastly, we'll touch a bit on engagement and incentives, which is really then how, as you're moving towards shifting a lot of decision-making and activities to the community, how do you make sure that, as many of those token holders or community members as possible are engaged and incentivized to participate. So maybe let's start with structure as a first point. And typically what we've seen with decentralization, and this is from the perspective of projects that start in a more quote unquote traditional way, which is with a core team that builds the V1 of the product and launches it, is a gradual let's say staged process of decentralization. So let's say you've built our product, you've launched it on mainnet, maybe you have a token, maybe not, that's fine. So stage one of the journey is when you start to give decisions, usually small decisions, to the community. So to a community of of users or token holders or whatnot. And what we've seen with quite a few projects, including some of our own portfolio companies, is usually community grants are one of the things that get decentralized as in that first stage, right? So for example, it could be a small pot of money, a small part of the treasury that might be used for community building, for marketing, for things like that. So something that is not too large in value and also relatively low risk, to decentralize. So even if things go wrong, it won't really have any sort of major impact on the protocol and the operations. And what we've seen, one example I'll give is Balancer, the DEX, where they had a pot of money that was effectively managed by one of the core team members that they were giving out for community building, for things like translations, AMAs, all these different marketing activities. They set up a small DAO of 5 people, and they basically now manage this pot of money, and they have a process through which they evaluate proposals and then decide to disperse the money or not. So that's the first stage. And typically, projects will then experiment with this. Of course, it's also a good opportunity for you to see what works, what doesn't, and then to refine as you go. And then you move on to stage 2. So progressively, you start to move, I guess, significant, more important decisions to the community. And so this is, of course, more of a DeFi example, but this would apply for any type of Web3 project where you might start to, give decision-making on, protocol economics, on risk parameters, things like that, given back to the community. And this usually happens, once you've been able to, well, first of all, once you have a very engaged community that is, actively participating on, proposals, on discussions, on voting. And once you're also able to identify, community members that have, knowledge and expertise on a particular topic. In this case, in the example here, whether it's on economics or on risk analytics. And then the last one is stage 3. So stage 3, these are usually the last type of decisions that should be decentralized, or these are, major, protocol decisions, maybe changes to the core parts of the code, and even potential changes to the governance framework itself, right? Now, we purposely didn't put any specific timing on this because I think how you go across the stages will be very different for each project. It'll depend on what Web3 vertical you're in. It'll depend on the engagement of your community. It'll depend on whether you believe that you have people with the right skills and knowledge in the community, etc. And I think just to put it into context, I think there are probably just a handful of Web3 projects that have reached stage 3, and these are some of the OG DeFi projects like Synthetics or Compound or Maker that have reached stage 3 just fairly recently, right? So that just gives you a little bit of context for that. Then moving on, I think the other thing that's quite important to share, right, is that when we talk about decentralization, there's actually a lot of different models, or there's different archetypes, and here the examples are for DeFi, but again, this applies to any type of Web3 project, and you really need to sort of look at each one and feel and get a sense of what's going to work best for you. I think of all the different models we've seen, we've developed 3 archetypes that we see that we've seen in Web3, and they're typically on a spectrum of the degree of human intervention, right? So how human intensive are they versus not? And so if you look at the left hand side, you have the algorithmic or governance minimized, which has very low level of human intervention, and this one is where you try to leave as many of the decisions as possible to an algorithm or to math, right? So a lot of times, not everything needs to be decided by a group of humans. Actually, some of them can be actually left to math to solve. And some good examples of this are Compound and Maker, and these two, DeFi projects have actually you left most of it to algorithms. Not everything, but a lot of the decisions on how the protocols work are actually left to algorithms. Then you have the next level, which is open community. And I think this one, another way to think of this one is direct democracy, where effectively every token holder or one token, one vote, and every token holder has equal, let's say or decision-making power, if you will. To be honest, we haven't really seen many successful examples of this model. I think primarily because, direct democracy is messy. I think even outside of Web3, we struggle to think of what's a really good example of this, where you have a large group of people, without like some kind of leadership or some sort of structure hierarchy. I think Aave initially was aiming to or aspiring to go with this, but they also adopted a council and sub-DAO model because they realized that once you have a certain number of people that need to organize, you need some sort of leadership and organization model. And then on the right hand side, you have this sort of council or sub-DAO model. I think Synthetics is a very famous example. I think they have, if I'm not mistaken, they have 5 or 7 sub-DAOs, and they also have the Spartan Council. Aave also has a number of sub-DAOs for different types of decisions. And then similarly, Maker actually falls under both this category as well as the algorithmic category. And this one is I think the best example to think of this is really the representative democracy, where every token holder has the I guess the right to make proposals, to vote, but typically the governance is structured around a number of councils or sub-DAOs. So you might have a sub-DAO that is looking at grants, one that's looking at treasury, one that's looking at the protocol itself, potentially even one looking at governance. Any type of decisions that you need to make, you might have a sub-DAO that is leading that. And what a sub-DAO is typically a group of 3, 5, or maximum 7 people who they'll have their own processes, their own cadence, and what they will do is they will on a periodic basis look at proposals from the community, evaluate them, and then make decisions on those. And so there's different models. I mean, that's sort of one type of model. There are other models where rather than being a body that reviews and approves proposals, it could also be a decision-making body directly, right? Where token holders might choose to delegate their power to propose or their power to vote on decisions to members of these councils or these sub-DAOs to make decisions. I think what's really interesting is that I think this is the model we see as emerging to be the most successful one, because it's a really good way to organize people. It's also a very good way to get people from the community with different skills and knowledge to organize. So, for example, if you have developers, they might organize around a protocol sub-DAO. If you have people with backgrounds in economics or business or risk, they might get together around an economic sub-DAO or a risk management sub-DAO or so. And so that's typically how it works. So that's it for structure. Then maybe now let me pass it back to Kia to talk a little bit about processes and tools and how some of the things she mentioned earlier fit all together with decentralization.
Sure, thanks so much. That was great and super relevant to what I will discuss in terms of Zodiac tooling. So I'll just share my screen again. So as mentioned in the governance report, I think that those three models for how DAO governance is currently playing out are really spot on. So looking at kind of more algorithmic or governance minimalized protocols versus DAOs that are kind of elected council with different sub-DAOs that report according to different specializations. So Zodiac tooling is definitely built with DAOs that kind of evolve and have multiple teams with multiple decision-making processes in mind. And maybe actually just to get a show of hands or emoji hands, I was wondering how many people on the call are familiar maybe with snapshot voting? Say roughly familiar. Cool, great. So I'll give one example about how the Zodiac tools can be used in practice using initially the snapshot voting platform. But basically the idea is that DAOs are evolving organisms and that most of our DAO tooling does not allow their governance mechanism to change, like say go from kind of compounds, more governance minimized protocol towards something that's much more kind of sub-DAO or council based in the future. Like how does a DAO go from one to another when it wants to change its process? Often this means totally uprooting the governance process and moving to a different platform, migrating entirely. But we believe at Gnosis Guild that there is another way. So you could say that a DAO begins as a squad with an idea or a small project team with an idea of a protocol they want to build or a service they want to bring to a community. And they deploy a Gnosis Safe multi-sig account as their avatar to manage their shared resources. And initially the Gnosis Safe has 4 to 6 signatures required to execute a transaction. And while informal proposals through a group chat suffice initially, eventually the decisions as a team or squad become more substantial. They decide to launch a token to expand their project. And in order to keep a more formal record of their decisions, they decide to create a snapshot space for token voting. And their first vote includes who should be elected as signers on their Gnosis Safe. So as mentioned before, this is more like the beginning of the council model. And then using the Zodiac app and Gnosis Safe, they equip exit so that anyone who holds their token can leave the organization with their proportional share of digital assets. And available through the Zodiac app on Gnosis Safe, the exit module prompts you to enter a token contract address, and it calculates the circulating supply amount. These refer to an ERC20 token, or quite soon an ERC 721 or NFT token. Participants can redeem for a proportional share of the Safe's compatible ERC20 digital assets. So the idea that the governance token represents a proportional share of the treasury for all those who have joined the community. And after equipping exit, the DAO progressed to the next stage of decentralization in terms of decentralizing access or kind of shares in the treasury. However, as time goes on, the community grows rapidly and develops many centers of activity through their token-enabled Discord. And one central team managing their Gnosis Safe becomes less than ideal. They decide to use reality, allowing both off-chain snapshot proposals and Discord polls to create on-chain Gnosis Safe transactions that anyone in the community can execute. So again, through the Zodiac app on Gnosis Safe, the reality module guides you through creating a DAO question template, a cooldown period, and a minimum bond for the escalation game-based oracle reality.eth, which guides the reality module. So basically what this does is allows you to bring information that's off-chain, any outcome of a vote or proposal, on-chain using an oracle to verify with economic incentives that the proposal came to pass. And then after you enable the reality mod on the Gnosis safe, you can go over, this is a screenshot from the snapshot interface, where you can add the SafeSnap plugin to your snapshot space. And this connects to the specific instance of the reality module deployed from the last screen. And so once configured, you can basically now add Gnosis safe transactions to a snapshot proposal. So for example, you could say you want to make a proposal to receive a 20,000 USD equivalent grant from a DAO. And you submit your proposal with a transaction already included that transfers 20K worth of assets to your treasury or to your team's account if the proposal is successful. So after proposal, if the proposal is successful and after it's confirmed to be successful by the oracle, then you can come back to the original snapshot proposal, and where it's highlighted here in red, you can execute the transaction, which means that anyone can come here and execute the transaction. You don't have to rely on the safe multi-sig signers in order to execute it for you. Because a lot of how the kind of council and sub-DAO governance currently exists is that there's many sub-DAOs who kind of make proposals to an overall council, but still rely on a kind of trusted team of signers to execute their proposal as requested. So with this step, the DAO has taken a massive leap towards decentralization. However, Gnosis safe signers, while they're still not relied on to execute transactions, they still have veto power of the transactions that come through the reality module and SafeSnap plugin. And so before removing those signers and their veto power, to add extra security to the new practice reality supports, that is taking off-chain votes on-chain so that anyone in the community can execute them, the DAO enables scope, which basically restricts the addresses and functions their Gnosis safe can call. And this basically is a security best practice, so you know that no kind of malicious functions can be called by the safe by anyone in the community. And after acclimating to using Snapshot and Gnosis safe with the Zodiac mods, reality and scope, they choose to disable the Gnosis safe signers and achieve kind of full decentralization of the DAO's core technical system managing resources. And this is just one way that the kind of Zodiac toolset and open standard can enable organic pathways for progressive decentralization, equipping DAOs for whatever adventures they may face. And continuing this example with a future scenario, eventually this DAO community would like more refined governance processes than token voting. So they take an interest in conviction voting, in which members can continuously signal their preferences, and they decide to use an upcoming conviction voting app on the XDAI network to save gas fees. Operating as a multi-chain DAO does not sacrifice composability, however, because they also enable the Zodiac Bridge module, shown here, which connects the conviction voting app deployed on the XDAI network to their Gnosis safe treasury deployed on Ethereum mainnet. In essence, this basically allows things like, as for mentioned, the kind of democracy or kind of direct democracy middle example in the governance chart that was displayed in the talk earlier, it allows, I think often this model kind of fails because there isn't a way to have more granular processes or allow kind of things that aren't just token voting evolve into different types of voting, whether it's one person, one vote, or conviction voting, or different styles of governance and decision-making. Often DAOs are kind of stuck with the initial process they set up, whether it's through a token voting snapshot model or otherwise. So Zodiac has really enabled that you keep your assets and your kind of overall treasury in one main account, and then you equip different mods as well as different kind of governance processes and change and evolve over time. So if you want to get involved or you want to use any of our tools, feel free to join the Gnosis Guild Discord, where you can just kind of get more used to different DAO tools that we built.
Awesome, great. Well, thanks, Kia, for sharing that. I think it was really, at least for me, going through like an actual example really brought it to life. I think lastly, I just wanted to touch quickly on the third dimension of our framework. Let me quickly share back my screen. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I do want to pass it to the teams for all their questions. But I think the third dimension we talked about was engagement and incentives. And one of the one of the things we hear a lot, even from some of the OG DeFi projects that have, almost fully decentralized, is that voter apathy is certainly an issue, right? And I think maybe it's human nature, right? Because it's not just in Web3, but even outside of Web3, you see a lot of voter apathy. And so I think when you think about how to address it, right? How do you actually activate community engagement? We think that there's three ways to do it. So one is incentives, right? Where either you can give rewards to token holders who stake, right? And so they can get both native token rewards, but they usually also get voting power boost. So that could be one way to get people more involved, especially for some of the smaller token holders who might think like, hey, I own just a handful of tokens, and the VCs are owning most of them, so they're going to make all the decisions, so my voice doesn't count. Typically, staking and giving voter boost power to token holders who stake for longer periods are some incentives that can be given. That also make some of the smaller token holders feel like they still have a say and have the power to make decisions, right? There's a few protocols that do I guess the opposite, which is penalties. Inverse finance is one of these examples where if you are a token holder, a community member, and you're not active either voting directly or even delegating their your vote, then your votes can actually be seized. Now, of course, it does feel like you don't necessarily want to go down this route of penalizing people, but it's always there as a potential option if that's something that you feel is the only way to get people to get more involved. And then the last one is actually delegation. And this one can be very powerful because if you look at community members, and some of these protocols that have tens of thousands of community members and token holders, I mean, the reality is that the majority of them may not be able to dedicate themselves full time to understand, okay, what's the protocol doing, what is the direction that we need to take on a lot of different topics. They might not have the time to even upskill, right, on the required skills for whatever is needed. And so it can feel like, hey, I'm a token holder, I'm going to vote, but I don't even have time to keep up with these things. And delegation is very powerful because you can actually delegate your power to vote to others who might have the time, might have the knowledge, and might have the skills to do that on your behalf. And the beauty with delegation is that it's not just a one-time thing. Typically, every project is different, but typically you delegate to a group of people, and then after a certain period of time, you can either choose to redelegate or you can actually choose to undelegate. If you're not happy with the way that they're proposing or voting. So anyway, I think this is now sort of a good kind of a moment to take a pause and maybe pass it on to the teams. And I'm sure that everybody has a lot of questions in their mind, but over to you guys. Any questions you have for Kia or for me, just go for it.
I do have one question.
Go for it.
So first of all, there's some amazing set of tools that you have shown, and my question was around that: how should we tie up the actions that we do as a product or as a DAO as strictly towards how the proposals are voted for? Let's say maybe in our case, those actions might not be funds distribution, but a new pull request that we take into our code base. So, but that might go through a proposal that should that new feature be added or not. So, do you have some recommendations on what tools we can use, or how should we approach a problem like that?
Sure. So I think for all teams, the answer to that will be different. A kind of broad approach is that one kind of concrete approach that's specifically related to the tooling, and then I'll give a more kind of broad, process-based approach. But in terms of the tooling, that could be accomplished in certain ways where, well, it will take some time because it would be easy for basically an off-chain decision to be brought on-chain and then executable in some way. I'm hoping with kind of different tool suites like Radical, which Radical, they're kind of aiming to be a decentralized code collaboration tool and kind of an answer to decentralized code collaboration, answer to GitHub. Not exactly the same model, but you can already set up code repos there and mirror them on Radical. And we've been working really closely with Radical as well that to use the Gnosis safe contract as the core for their organizational account on GitHub. So every Radical org or repository that's like a GitHub repo is actually a safe contract and is managed by a DAO now. So that means that fundamentally, like all of the Radical tools will be fully composable with the Zodiac toolset. And I hope that like as their kind of code collaboration stack develops, that there will potentially be more on-chain transactions or pull requests to repos. So you could imagine that if that triggers something on-chain or a kind of executable transaction, it would be easy to kind of use an ABI encoder to include that with your proposal on Snapshot and then have it executable. We're not there yet. And I would say also that the kind of general need to have it fully executable by anyone in the community is not something that teams really need immediately. You know, in the kind of earlier examples of like how synthetics evolved or other teams evolved towards more decentralized answers, it really took those teams several years to actually get there. And right now there's DAOs like kind of Shapeshift that's using the reality mod and SafeSnap, and they've been in the game for 7+ years. So I think first, like building up coherence and trust within your team and getting a process working by which you decide pull requests being accepted by proposals. And then later towards when you feel like you really want it to be open and decentralized, maybe it's like a token transaction or something else on chain that verifies it in the interim before that there's like an on-chain PR accepted transaction. But I think that like reality is quite radical in how decentralized it actually is. So I encourage teams to like work for many years before doing it.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think the other thing I would add, which I think slightly addresses your question, is that, and I think Kia mentioned this at the beginning, that each project is different, right? And the answer to this will be different to, where you are in the decentralization journey, and what tools you have available, and also how you set up the process for proposals, right? I think on the one hand, you could have something where whoever's writing the once you've gone through the temperature check and consensus check and all that, whoever's writing the proposal should be able to write it in code, and once it gets voted, it gets added to the contract. But that's not always the case, right? And I mean, we've also had experience with writing proposals for some DeFi protocols where there was a question around, like, should we write the proposal more as from a conceptual point of view, and then kind of, for lack of a better word, worry about the code later, or not. And we chose to do it, right? And I think the interesting thing is that, I mean, there's pros and cons, right? But the interesting thing is that, we wrote the proposal, it passed. It actually did raise some questions around integration, but you can still have that process, and you can still have, like, a proposal that gets voted in favor becomes more like a guide to, okay, we're going to go this direction, we need to do it. And maybe as we're updating the code for something else, this can be part of it, going forward.
Got it.
Cool. Any other burning questions on governance and processes and tools?
No, not really. I just wanted to say thank you for the overview. It was very interesting to kind of see that journey and that transition. I think there'll be a lot for us to kind of keep up to date with and keep following the developments in this space. And it's interesting to see you're building the tools with room for growth as well, which is awesome.
Cool, thank you. And if you don't mind, actually, I would share in the chat here an essay I've written related to DAOs, because I think in this talk, I've basically kind of spoken about like the infrastructure and more kind of tool-based process rather than general kind of social approach to DAOs. So I'd just like to drop a link to this essay that I wrote called a Pre-History of Daos, which if anyone is interested, maybe more on the kind of social process side, to also feel free to give this a read, and it will give like a more kind of fully fleshed background to like our impetus in working on Zodiac tooling.
All right. If I may, Kia, great to see you here. And thanks, Bury, for going through our fantastic report. Looks really nice. I'd love to get the chance to maybe go through some examples, Kia, of DAOs, right, that are newer, perhaps, right? Because I think the examples that we drew upon to create the report are like very DeFi focused. And nowadays, it's beyond that, right? There are, like you mentioned, there could be NFT communities that use NFT as the way of voting. And then, of course, there are a bunch of different types of DAOs, like service DAOs, venture DAOs, and so on, and social DAOs as well. So it could be that some of our members here or some of the audience listening to the recording might not fall into the kind of DeFi protocol DAO. So how would you like to share some examples of these different types, and how would the decentralization journey be slightly different? Some examples would be great.
Sure. So I guess one example that I think probably in the social DAO space that most people will be relatively familiar with that's using our tool stack is FWB. So the Friends with Benefits social DAO, right? Kind of early token gated community. And basically they've always, or kind of recently, used Snapshot and Gnosis Safe as their core DAO platforms. So people holding the FWB token can vote on proposals. And really nicely recently, especially given the kind of public critiques they've gotten, they've enabled many more voting strategies that are actually more one person, one vote, or at least one wallet, one vote. And Snapshot itself, I think it's not fully known, enables a lot more strategies than just kind of pure token voting. It enables things like quadratic voting. It enables kind of authentication, and all of those from a simple drop-down menu when you create a proposal or a space. So it's actually much more already kind of modular than many people know it to be. And one way that FWB has evolved is that they have their overall kind of main DAO, which has been successful at building a community and have a core team at its heart. And then they've recently launched a program to do city DAOs and basically elected, I think, 2 people to lead different city DAOs in a bunch of different cities over the world. And that city DAO process, basically, they'll also use the Gnosis Safe and Snapshot platforms. And right now we're discussing with them about basically how those DAOs can use Zodiac tooling also to report to the main overall DAO. So I think that this will be a much more common kind of setup among social DAOs, but DAOs in general, as they like evolve and become much more like local context or place-based, is that they will have that kind of council model where there's an overall DAO, maybe related to a specific token, but then there's councils or sub-DAOs in specific cities or related to specific kind of endeavors. You see this a little bit with DeFi and Maker's core units. But especially in the kind of social DAO side, like event-based or city-based DAOs will become, I think, a really big thing next. And there's the question of basically how do those city DAOs like report to the main DAO? And how do they then decide their own decision-making over time that's the main DAO? And this is where like Zodiac tooling is super impactful because you can have it so that safes themselves are members of the overall main DAO, but also have things like the exit mod where those safes can redeem treasury from the overall DAO just based on holding the governance token. You can also have it so that they can use using Sila, basically any governance strategy that they want to use internally, but then have a different governance strategy that they use with the main DAO that they interact with. And basically, as we see more and more kind of nested DAOs grow in different social DAOs, like we're going to need highly composable tooling because otherwise a lot of these DAOs will be like haunted by decisions that they've made or decisions that they haven't even personally made, but people who initially started the main DAO made many years ago.
Awesome. Yeah, that is indeed quite different, and FW indeed at the forefront of that. Another example I'd love to hear from your experience, Kia, is of course from Gnosis itself, right? Because Gnosis has been around for many years and there's a huge treasury. We know there's an original product, the whole decision markets, and then later on, there's like options, and now there's like Safe, right? And then CowSwap, and now there's Zodiac as well. So how did the Gnosis DAO come about? How are the guilds organized, and what are some lessons you'd like to share from that?
Sure. So a lot of the inspiration for the tooling that we're building was just seeing what the ecosystem lacked. And as we came to consider what types of tools we wanted to use for Gnosis DAO, which we initialized actually almost exactly a year ago, there was a few main concerns we have is that we wanted basically an account that we could change over time. We looked at the existing kind of decision-making tools, and we love Monolith DAO. We love a lot of the tool sets available from Aragon. But we also knew that Gnosis DAO would like evolve in ways that we couldn't expect because we actually want it to be run by the community over time. So our main concern in doing Gnosis DAO is basically having an account at the core that we trusted. And we obviously trusted the Gnosis safe, but that could change and evolve over time and actually give people greater access. So with a lot of the accounts, people have to apply to be members, or there's kind of less of a permissionless way to enter in the case of, say, Moloch DAOs. And we said, okay, if we use the safe as like a fundamental account, we can always build things around it, and the community can build things around it because it's an open project. So we trust that this is not just a kind of DAO setup that will last 1 or 2 years while DAOs are popular, but a DAO setup that could last like literally decades. So that's why we've built all these tools. And it's funny also, other DAOs even started using like Reality and Safe Snap before us. So it's really kind of validated our setup that, that you really need kind of cross-platform tooling rather than monolithic platform tooling.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's kind of like, instead of just the token holding, right, you can have these safe accounts. And because it's a safe account, you actually have a bank account, so to speak, right? Because if it's just by token holding, you actually don't have somewhere to store your assets, be it your own tokens or funding, right? You kind of need to like assign a particular person. So that is indeed interesting. How does that? So would you kind of advise, right? How do you think about a safe owner or a safe signer being a vote or a member of the DAO versus having DAO tokens? Right? Does it make sense to have both types of entities voting in similar proposals? How would you kind of like separate or merge these two?
Sure. Yeah. So my overall answer to questions like that is that it's always like super DAO specific because no DAOs are the same. And it really depends on like what the core team and also core teams and community have kind of shared culturally in terms of coherence and trust, and what types of decision-making processes they're most used to. So the reason why I think we're seeing coin voting, for better or worse, often for worse, take root mostly in the space is because it's incredibly easy to arrive at kind of a signaling point and relatively kind of unanimously understood across different teams and cultures, right? And so I think that that's beautiful and really wonderful way to like take from a really broad audience of either token holders or individuals. But as kind of different teams have different processes, I think we should see a lot more experimentation, both in decision making, but also what tokens are. So I think for given grants programs, having something like kind of multi-signers, like 4 out of 6, that still have veto power and have the reality module set up so that anyone can execute proposals, that in case a malicious proposal were to pass, they still have veto power. That feels good to me because I think that it's really important to have like good security practices around treasuries, because it's not just like the signer's treasury, it's really a community treasury. And you want to make sure that sometimes there are fail stops there. You don't always need full decentralization from the start. And so what I could see is kind of a core team using something like the multi-sig treasury. And then we have the exit mod, which is like actually quite flexible, even more so than Moloch, because how it's set up is basically, you could say you have a governance token, it's an ERC20 token gov. And basically if you hold, and that your safe treasury sets up the exit mod and said, anyone who holds the gov token can access the treasury. And say there's a bunch of ETH in the treasury. So anyone who holds, say, like 1% of the circulating supply of the gov token can then come to the treasury and redeem 1% of its assets, or its treasury assets apart from the gov token. And so that looks pretty clear when you use like typical ERC20 tokens, how we've seen with most of the DAOs. But then if you start thinking about like reputation tokens or things like how Flamingo DAO uses non-transferable NFTs or non-transferable tokens to basically claim membership in the DAO. So here it could be a kind of token that only allows it to be redeemed from the treasury, but is not a speculative asset or cannot be transferred in and of itself, and is actually gained more of over time based on participation rather than kind of buying or purchasing power or previous contributions. So the more that we kind of look at tokens more as authentication tools and kind of proofs of participation or proofs of meaningful contribution, then a lot of the decision-making processes also change, and token voting doesn't just look plutocratic, it looks more based on kind of dedication.
Very cool, awesome. And I think you also touched on a lot of elements I think we were sharing earlier around, some of these critical decisions. And I think that, a lot of times the tooling is not just enabling the decentralization, but also mitigating some of the risks that can come from doing so, and of course risk of attack, right? So I think that's also very important to bring up and to keep in mind.
Yeah, because I think like proper technical decentralization is still incredibly new with the tool stack that we're building. So it like really not only has to be technically tested and audited, but socially tested. So a lot of social processes and trust need to happen around that kind of technical infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so Kei, you touched on reputation, right? And I think that's an incredibly fascinating topic, and it's at the forefront of what everyone's thinking as well, because it's kind of like, to me, it sounds a bit like a patchwork of kind of fixes of the token holdings, because ideally token holdings would already fully and accurately reflect how much value you've provided to the ecosystem, be it in terms of capital or contribution, and you distribute it in that way, right? And then, or you buy in to enter. But they're incomplete because they lack of the qualitative components of like the social networks and the qualitative contributions that you might have made. And those are then typically recognized in the form of reputation. There's no clear standard yet as to, or clear practices yet as to how do you recognize that and how do you distribute reputation, so to speak. Who should you distribute? How should you distribute? How should you represent it? What are some examples you like to highlight, and how do they relate to governance?
Sure. So one of my favorite examples actually doesn't come from the DAO space, but I talk about it a little bit in the essay that I shared in the chat of Pre-History of Daos. It's actually how gaming guilds have learned to distribute reputation and participation points. So there's this system called DKP, Dragon Kill Points, that it's been around since 1999 and was initially developed for a specific MMO, but basically it's spread around to a lot of like large open world gaming sites that where different teams and guilds kind of play together to accomplish common goals. And basically key to that is that after a goal has been accomplished, often loot is dropped. Now loot is like a loaded word in the Ethereum community, but basically loot is dropped, and often, like for example, in World of Warcraft, that loot is non-transferable. So whoever picks it up after it's been dropped has it forever. And so obviously as a guild, it matters that the same people work together, again, because they have like complementary skill sets and like they've learned how to work together. So it's really important that the distribution of loot is perceived as being fair, because otherwise it would sow discord among the team. So with the DKP system, basically it varies between different game worlds and in implementations, but roughly every guild player who's participated in a mission is awarded some DKP. It varies a bit like how much and specifically, but you can just say broadly, they're awarded some DKP based on their participation in raids. And then in a lot of systems, they can then spend this DKP if they see a particular loot item they would like to, either good for their character or kind of one that they've been looking after for a while, that they can then spend these DKP points in exchange for this loot item. And then also often these loot items become very special kind of signaling on their own, because it shows that that like say they've saved up a bunch of DKP points and gotten a really kind of high value item. And then possessing that high value item also has a form of reputation in itself in the game. And yeah, there's a bunch of different ways by which they do it, but I really recommend there's this, it's called Dragon Kill Points, a summary white paper, which looks at a specific instance in the, driven by the leftovers in a World of Warcraft server that looks at kind of like market allocation of publicly owned goods through the DKP system. I can share a link to it. But I really think that gaming guilds have developed a lot of patterns around basically how participation and reputation points are used, but then also spent. And I think that DAOs could learn a lot from them, because the communities are actually relatively similar in terms of being initially online, common goals, open world. That said, I think the DAO space still has a long way to go. And I think particularly because a lot of the instances people are reliant for income, which is definitely sometimes the case in MMOs, but not often. And for this reason, basically, actually the vote closes tomorrow. But we've had a proposal from the token engineering team to do a 5-month research program on reward systems for DAOs. And we want to partially fund it as Gnosis. And they're basically going to get it, like, I think 20 teams of 2 researchers each to look at different reward systems and contribution systems in DAOs and publish a report and best practices about how to better kind of meaningfully track contributions, because there's obvious things like that are quite gameable, like how often you post in Discord, And also the question of often it's the people who might have the most free time due to their economic position that are the most able to kind of gamify those metrics, and that you want to make a more inclusive and equitable community. And you have to take those things into account as well when you're distributing economic rewards, reputation rewards as well. So hopefully, basically, I'm really, for Gnosis Guild and Gnosis more generally, like we want to be super mindful of how we implement reputation and reward systems. So I'm really waiting until kind of we work through and work with the teams on this report before kind of implementing clear one-to-one feedback loops, because I think that, yeah, the current, like, if you post in Discord, it's worth a token is not necessarily the long-term solution.
Yeah, a lot of
that's so true.
can be exploited. I know we're running out of time. If I may just wrap up with a quick one and conceptual kind of go back to the fluffy thing. DAOs or Web3 governance, do you think of it more like equity, board voting on issues governing a company, or more like a country's citizens voting on their future fate? Because I think like the mental model is slightly different, and maybe kind of like it's a bit of a philosophical question as well, or maybe somewhere in between, like some third space. How do you think about it?
Yeah, so I always feel like it's a third space that we don't have the language for yet. And sometimes I often feel like it's definitely more towards the civic angle and the kind of city or kind of local governance perspective, where hopefully it's not always a kind of clear mandate or just kind of direct like something like stakeholder capitalism, but actually something that involves civic participation and meaningful contributions. I do feel like often, and we're seeing now, I think, the emergence of a lot of thinking around cities as DAOs, but to me, this feels a little bit kind of like horseless carriages, where we don't exactly know like the name to call a new type of organization. So I see it really DAOs as like civic participation. It's not fully based on locality, but ideally it aligned by values and a kind of broader and network place-based civic participation. So yeah, I would say neither, and more towards like a third way that like just doesn't have the proper language yet, because we've never been able to think through what it means to have like a large, diverse and specialized participation of decision making.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's a very nice note. I feel that it's like half a podcast episode now. Sorry to hijack a little bit. Yeah, back to you guys, Bury, or anybody else.
Awesome. Well, I think before we close, anybody has any other questions or anything that you want to bring up with Kia, Shikai, or myself?
Shortly?
Yeah, go for
quickly, it. Like, I'm wondering, because we're now in this world where, we're in this world where a lot of protocols are present on maybe multiple chains. So I'm not sure, like the tooling you mentioned, for example, like coupling Snapshot to a multi-sig wallet. Is it also something that is supported across multiple chains, or is it something that's being worked on?
Yeah, so a lot of the initial impetus for Zodiac was also that we really think the kind of future is multi-chain, both on layer 2s, and I work on a little bit on Cosmos projects as well, so I'm very long multi-chain. But yeah, so basically the core account, the Gnosis Safe, is available on quite a lot of layer 2s and sidechains at the moment. So it's on mainnet, but also you can deploy the Gnosis Safe on XDAI, you can deploy it on Polygon, Arbitrum, and we have the full rollout plan of Optimism, basically all the layer 2s in line already. And basically wherever the safe is deployed, for the most part, as long as there's a factory deployed to that network, you can access all of the Zodiac app tools. And a lot of the Zodiac app tools are actually specifically built to bridge cross-chain transactions. So the bridge module basically allows any kind of bridge that's built between chains, say XDAI and mainnet. But in the future, as more bridges are built, so any EVM compatible chain to communicate across each other. So you could have like a DAO house on XDAI, control a safe on mainnet. All of that's fully possible. You could have a DAO on Polygon, control a safe on mainnet, or vice versa. You could even have a safe on Polygon, control a safe on mainnet, and basically just skew it towards security of assets. Also with things like Snapshot. So Snapshot is like gasless voting. It just takes a record at a certain block time of where tokens are held in which wallets. And they've actually already introduced multi-network support. So they support XDAI. Obviously they support Rinkeby for testing. I think that they support quite a large range of layer 2s, but I don't want to say any and be wrong about them. But yeah, we use it on XDAI, and there's also the support now that on the block number snapshots that they take, they also can do multi-chain, so they can look at on XDAI for a given token and on mainnet for a given token. Obviously slightly different because they would be wrapped in across the bridge, but that's possible to do all in one snapshot proposal vote. So yeah, like super pro multi-chain and pro kind of private voting, multi-chain, bridge over to mainnet, all of that.
Okay, cool. Like, personally, we also used like Snapshot to let our community vote on like a meme contest, just also to prepare them to like set up a wallet, etc., to make sure everything works. It was a lot of fun actually. And indeed, like since then, a lot of new features got added, like the multi-chain aspect of it. At that point, it wasn't possible yet, but like I'll look into it, and because it's something that a lot of projects can use. Like if you're spread across chains, you don't want your votes to only leave it in one place, right? But yeah, okay, thanks a lot for answering the question.
Yeah, for sure. We did last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago. We've been doing it every week, but the one 2 weeks ago, we did a Gitcoin kernel fellow session, basically on using a snapshot vote on XDAI and a safe on XDAI that bridged over to a Moloch DAO. So I think the recording's online.
Awesome, great. Well, I think with that, we'll probably come to a close. So I want to thank Kei so much for joining us today, for sharing so much about, the process, the tools, and also some of the non-DeFi examples, of how we're seeing these DAOs adopt decentralized governance, which is great. Also thanks to all the participants who joined us. If you have any questions that come up later, as usual, feel free to reach out on Slack or on Telegram. I also shared our report on Slack, so do have a read. There's also some really nice examples. They're all DeFi, but of course the principles apply regardless of what you're building. And yeah, as usual, just feel free to reach out on the topic. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you around soon.